landscapes far and wide. I'm Kristen Ryan. I really appreciate you joining us here tonight. Before I get started, I just wanted to quickly say that I apologize if there's any extraneous noise coming from my end. We have severe thunderstorms going past. Hopefully that won't be disruptive or cut any power off. If you happen to hear my dogs barking from downstairs, they're not too bad, but I do have storms going through. So I just wanted to let you know that. So as Rui and Mike said, this is a 4-part series for the next 4 weeks. And the series will cover various aspects of landscape photography, from technical to creative. I will talk about my approach using a wide range of focal lengths, and how I tell stories of the landscape that inspire me to click the shutter. Today's presentation is set for success, preparing to get out in the field in a variety of ways. Next week is more focused on wide angle to mid-range photography using those focal lengths and lenses, as well as long exposure photography, creating depth. And our third week focused more on intimate scenes, telephoto landscapes, creating variety from one location and within the scene. And the last week is saved for critique of images that you all take and share with us over the next few weeks. So that said, I believe wherever we are in our journeys as photographers, we can learn and be inspired from others. So I hope that whether you're in the beginning stages of learning or more experienced, you find yourself inspired and yearning to pick up your camera at the end of each of these webinars. So before I get started, I just wanted to share a little bit about myself for anyone who does not know me or my work. I'm a landscape and nature photographer from outside Chicago. I am also a mom of 4 with kids ranging from 10 to 15. That's a job that often makes it hard to get out and photograph very often, but it also makes me appreciate my time in the field even more. I grew up with a love for nature, and I was especially influenced by my yearly visits to my grandparents' home in the Tetons. I think that's where I just truly fell in love with nature, and it's had a very big impact on my photography as well. I've used a camera to document my life and travels since I was a young girl, but it was about 10 years ago that I truly invested the time to learn how to control my camera. I took one local class and was completely hooked. I started out shooting everything and my kids were little, but it was on a solo trip to the Tetons in the fall of 2012, my love of landscape photography was truly realized. I spent a weekend just hiking and roaming around all by myself, me and the landscape I loved and my camera. And it led me to diving into this genre, becoming completely immersed and trying to learn all that I could. A couple years later, I began to teach an online landscape photography class with PhotoSchool, and taught that for twice a year, still going on. And over a few years' time, this class developed such an amazing group of female photographers that loved nature and landscape. And I was really longing to bring about an in-person experience. So in 2017, I launched my first landscape photography retreat for women, Magic in the Tetons. And I've expanded my retreats to other locations such as Chicago, Banff, and Glacier National Park. I love to be out in nature teaching, connecting with others, and these retreats really bring all of that together for me. Landscape photography brings me into the moment and puts aside all other thoughts except for the light, the scene, and what's in my viewfinder. It's really a calming and meditative therapeutic activity for me, and especially in the midst of busy life as a mom. I'm sure that many of you out there also feel the same way about this pursuit of photography and just immersing ourselves and capturing the world around us that speaks to us. So we'll click over, hopefully, oh, there we go. Okay. So over the course of all my slides, you will notice at the bottom of the screen or in the corner of the images, I do have listed the focal length and settings that I used for each image, just in case you're curious as we go. And I just quickly wanted to also share the lenses that are used, assortment of lenses that are used for the images in this webinar. And you can see the list here is the Sigma 14 f1.8 art lens, the Sigma 24 to 70 f2.8 art lens, the Sigma 24 to 105 f4, and the Sigma 150 to 600 f5 to 6.3 contemporary lens. So that just gives you a little information. I combine those lenses with my Nikon 850 and Z6. So I just, in case you have any questions about that to start, those are some helpful answers. Click this. So before we get started into setting for success, I just wanted to share, what is landscape photography? And Wikipedia says that landscape photography shows spaces within the world, sometimes vast and unending, but other times microscopic. Landscape photographs typically capture the presence of nature, but can also focus on man-made features or disturbances of landscapes. It's a pretty broad view, and I know sometimes people think of landscape photography as mostly the grand landscapes and wide open views, and that certainly is the case, but it also encompasses so much more and more stories within those grand scenes. So today's webinar, Set for Success. And there's 3 things that I wanted to talk about that we can do to prepare and set ourselves up for success in landscape photography. So the first one is our gear, and we want to chat about the gear we need to create compelling landscape photographs. What do we carry in our bag that helps us to create these images? There are many cameras, lenses, and other gear to fit many budgets and photographic styles. And the best camera for you on any given day is the one that you know and are most comfortable using. The fanciest, most advanced camera could arrive on your doorstep tomorrow, but if you don't feel comfortable with all the buttons and menus, that's going to limit your success. So today we'll talk about various pieces of gear that I use for landscape photography, but I truly think the most important thing is that regardless of what gear you use, you get to know it well so you're comfortable and have an ease of workflow in the field. The second thing to prepare is our technical knowledge and skills. Taking the time to really learn both your camera and settings to create strong technical images is a critical step in setting up for success. Today, we'll discuss some of the technical knowledge and skills that are important in creating a smooth and comfortable workflow. The last thing I think is important to prepare is to have a creative mindset. Attitude and mindset is just important in the process of creating images as checking off those technical boxes. It is through our vision and creativity that we bring personal expression and stories to our images. So just a list of gear that are in my bag that we all might need, for sure need to capture images, and also some things that are really helpful for being creative in the field. And of course, we need a camera. We would be lost without the camera to capture images. But of course, there's so many options. There's DSLRs and there's mirrorless and different brands and so many options. And all of them can capture fantastic images if they're a camera that you're comfortable using. So the main thing to be worried about if you're considering, oh, is this camera the best one for me? If it's suiting your needs and allowing you to capture your vision, that's a great camera for you. I really just encourage you to really get to know your camera and be comfortable using it in the field. If you find that you aren't getting the results that you need, then maybe it's time to upgrade or find something smaller if you're having issues with weight. But the best camera is the one that you are comfortable using and can easily use in the field. Lenses. This is an interesting topic, and we'll go over so many different lenses and focal lengths over the course of the next few weeks. Many people often think of landscape photography, as I mentioned before, the grand landscapes with wide angle lenses. I often have people ask me, oh, what's your favorite landscape lens? Because they want to buy one lens. But the truth is that my favorite lens is the lens or focal length that best captures the story of the scene in front of me. Sometimes that is the dramatic sky, the grand landscape with the amazing views that go on forever. And then I will grab my 14mm, or I'll use the wider focal lengths of my 24 to 105 or 24 to 70. But other times I reach for my 150 to 600, or I'm zooming into 105 on the 24 to 105, because I want to isolate a pocket of light in a group of trees, or the hint of a mountaintop peeking through the clouds. It simply depends on the story I want to convey. So I'm definitely not the one to tell anyone, oh, this is the one lens that you need, because I truly use a whole variety of focal lengths. That said, if you are feeling limited with your lenses and your budget won't allow you to buy that ultra wide or telephoto lens that you're seeking, there are things that you can do. For example, to get a wider scene, you can always learn and practice shooting panoramas to get that wider view. And with many of our cameras nowadays, with such high resolution, within reason, you can often crop in to get closer to the story that you're trying to tell. Tripods, those lovely things that we love and hate. They can be so cumbersome and annoying and fumbling at times, but they can also be your best friend. Tripods are critical in any situation requiring slow shutter speeds, whether that's for your exposure needs or creative effects. They increase sharpness and keep your composition stable for purposes of exposure bracketing or focus stacking. There are so many tripods out there by many companies at different price points. And I highly recommend that you experiment and go to a camera store and try out tripods if you don't have one that you love, because it makes such a huge difference when you're comfortable adjusting the legs, putting the camera on the tripod head and adjusting it while it's on there. Especially in low light, in the dark or changing light, you'll be really happy if you're easily able to change it. I've gone through several tripods, and it makes a difference when you have one that's light and one that is easy to adjust and get set up. Just like getting to know your camera and knowing where all the buttons are and how to use it, getting comfortable with that tripod will make things easier for you when you're out in the field. And on that note, there's another little piece of gear that I love that combines the tripod with your camera, and that's an L bracket. If you don't have an L bracket, I think they're life-changing. They are specific to each camera body. They go on your camera and they stay there, and you make sure it's compatible as well with your tripod. I have one for each of my camera bodies, and they stay tighter than any tripod plate I've ever had, and I highly recommend using one of them, because I can't wait. Believe that I waited so long to put mine on. So definitely something that I recommend looking into. On that note of tripods, while it is your best friend in many situations, I really want to suggest that when you are using the tripod and you're going out to shoot, that you walk around and look, see what perspective you want to shoot from. Walk around, try different heights, look through your viewfinder, figure out kind of where you want to be before you set that tripod up. Make the tripod work for you as a tool to get the composition that you want to get, rather than walking out there, putting the tripod down, and then being discouraged away from what might be the best perspective just because you don't want to fumble around with this tripod that's driving you crazy. So the tripod should be your tool and shouldn't limit you from moving around or altering your position for a better shot. So beyond the camera, lenses, and tripod, which I think really are super critical to many of our images. There's also filters are a great tool for landscape photography that can help you both technically as well as creatively. So I have certain filters that I always have in my bag. Now I keep hitting the wrong button to go forward. The first one is a polarizing filter. I always have one of these in my camera backpack. A circular polarizer will screw onto the front of your lens, and then it has another little ring. And when you turn it, that creates the polarizing effect. If you're not familiar with these fun filters, just think of a sunny day when you put on your polarizing sunglasses. Suddenly, the colors become more vivid, the haze and glare lessens, and the clouds are so much more defined. This is what a polarizer can do for your images. It cuts out some of those harsh rays of the sun that create the glare. One thing to keep in mind, actually there's a couple things to keep in mind with the polarizing filter. The first is that it works best at 90 degrees from the sun. So if you're kind of looking towards the sun, it will be best 90 degrees to your right or your left, or when the sun is overhead, kind of every direction is 90 degrees. Another thing to watch out for with polarizers is at very wide angles, they can create an inconsistent polarizing effect through your image. And this is especially the case, can be obvious in a funky way in the sky, where you can get areas in part of the sky and not in others. It's not a great look, and it's not fun to deal with in post-processing. So if you're using a polarizing filter with a wider angle lens, especially wider than 24 millimeters or wider, be aware that this can happen, and kind of watch for that, because it's definitely not fun. There's a few different situations where I love to use my polarizer. One of them is in situations like this image that is up on the screen right now, moving creeks and waterfalls. The polarizer is wonderful for cutting out glare that is on the foliage surrounding the waterfalls and water, and helps just helps bring out the color and avoids glare. This particular image, just a couple little notes about this image, is this was taken in the Smoky Mountains this past fall. And I chose to use the 24 to 70 lens here, 36 millimeters. And I zoomed in a little bit because I wanted to make the cascade a prominent focal point of the image, but I didn't zoom in further because I wanted to keep the golden light and colors that were coming in from the left side. I also used a neutral density filter here in order to get a 4-second exposure to smooth out some of the water. Other situations I love to use the polarizer are especially a little bit of hazy days to bring out definition in the clouds, in the sky, as well as bringing out nice rocks underneath mountain glacial lakes. Neutral density filters are also a wonderful filter that help with creative and technical issues in our landscape images. There are two kinds of neutral density filters. There's graduated neutral density filters, and then there are regular neutral density filters. The graduated filters will cut out light from part of your frame. The filter will have part of the filter will be darkened to take out some of the light from your image. And then the other half will be clear, so that part of your image will not be affected at all. This is super helpful in a situation such as a really bright sky when you have a darker foreground, and you can take out, say, 2 to 3 stops of light from your sky, which allows you to expose your foreground and shadows brighter, and without blowing the highlights in your sky. And this is really helpful when you're dealing with a higher dynamic range in your scene. Sometimes I don't always use a graduated neutral density filter, to be honest, because sometimes I choose, if I need to deal with a high dynamic range, sometimes I will just bracket exposures instead of fumbling with filters, but I also think that they can be a really helpful tool. Some people use them all the time, and I think that there's something worth mentioning. If they are something that you want to explore, they can be a really great tool, and they can help limit time in post-processing as well. The regular ND filters I use all the time. They cut out light from your entire frame, and there's a whole range of number of stops that how many stops of light they will cut from your image. So the 3-stop, 6-stop, and 10-stop tend to be the most popular neutral density filters. The ones that I use the most are the 6-stop and the 10-stop. The 6-stop I love for capturing water from, say, about 0.4 seconds to 10 seconds. I feel like the 6-stop is a perfect range for me to play with the shutter speed and moving water. If I really want to get a more silky look in the water or get moving clouds, both of which I also love to do, that's when I usually turn to the 10-stop filter. And we'll go much more into long exposure photography and tips and ways that I do that in next week's webinar. And then just in addition to the 10-stop, if you want to do really long exposures of clouds, for example, 1, 2, 3 minutes, then I highly recommend either a 15-stop neutral density filter or stacking your 6 and 10 stops. I find that in the bright daylight, a 10-stop can only get me about 30 seconds. So if I want to get more movement in the clouds, I need to go for cutting out a lot more light. So again, we'll share more about that next week. Quick note, along with these neutral density filters and long exposures, the last piece of gear that I always have in my bag is a remote shutter. I also often use it as an intervalometer. I know many cameras have in-camera intervalometers, but I also like to have the remote shutter so that I can avoid having any slight camera shake that can happen when you press a shutter, especially in some of the longer exposures. So I find that very useful, and it also will program exposures over 30 seconds when I put my camera in bulb mode for those long exposures. So those are the gear that I always have in my bag, and highly recommend exploring any of those if you don't already have them in your bag. And before we move on from here, I'll just share that this long exposure is 15 seconds, captured in Maui this past spring break. I chose to use a longer exposure to bring out the really dreamy quality of the water in this particular image. I actually experimented with a variety of different shutter speeds on this evening, from like kind of 0.4 where you could still see water splashing and more waves. And then in this one, I did longer where it kind of sets that really dreamy and calming feel. So both can be great. And the neutral density filters will help you to achieve those different kinds of looks. So after you have all of your gear, what do you do with all of this gear to make sure you're comfortable capturing the images and dealing with all the menus of your cameras? So I'm just going to go through some of the different settings and approaches that I might use. I know that there's lots of different ways to do things in photography and landscape photography. Other people might do things in different ways, and you might have a way that works for you that isn't the way I do it. And I'm not here necessarily to change you, but to offer what my experience is. So camera mode, aperture mode versus manual. I know there's lots of landscape photographers that shoot in aperture mode, and I know other landscape photographers that shoot in manual mode, and which is better. I don't think that there's necessarily a better or a right way to do it. I think it's the way that works for you, but there's benefits in different situations to each one. For aperture mode, this really simplifies and quickens the process of achieving proper exposure. with your ISO set and your aperture set for depth of field, your camera will set your shutter speed for you, and this makes it much quicker to get the proper exposure. A real quick note, however, with aperture mode, your camera will be metering for 0. And metered at 0 is not always the perfect base exposure. Sometimes you still can have some blown highlights, or it might not be, it still could be underexposed depending on your scene. So if you use aperture mode, I just recommend you kind of are aware what your camera is doing. And if you want to switch and tell your camera, hey, this isn't bright enough, you can use your exposure compensation to tell it to expose a little brighter. Or on the flip side, if you notice that there's blown highlights that you want the camera to protect, you can tell it to expose a little bit darker. Manual mode I find to be preferable in situations where you really want to be controlling all of your settings in both the depth of field as well as your shutter speed, such as, you know, like I said, long exposure photography. So that's one time when I especially prefer to shoot in manual mode. Whichever route you go, I just recommend having a good understanding of the exposure triangle and how to shoot in manual mode, especially because if your camera is not giving you the results that you desire, then you feel knowledgeable and capable of changing things around. So just wanted to share quickly my settings, how I approach my settings in landscape photography with relating to manual mode or creative effect. I think in general, through most photography and landscape photography with our ISO, I want to keep it as low as possible for the highest quality of images. But that said, I'm never afraid to raise ISO in order to achieve proper exposure. When it comes to aperture and depth of field, more often than not, and you'll probably see this as we go through some of the images, and you can see some of my settings, I'm often between f8 and f16, depending on the image. You'll maybe notice when I have the longer focal lengths, often when I'm shooting with the 150 to 600 handheld, which I'm not afraid to do, I will often open up my aperture more to allow for a faster shutter speed so I'm not having camera shake. And I'll talk much more about using this particular lens in our third week webinar. When I'm shooting long exposures, I often also may close down more past f16 in order to allow for that shutter speed to open. But f8 to f16 is generally a good range depending on the scene. In many, but not all of our landscape photographs, we want to achieve sharpness throughout the frame, and aperture is just one of those factors that contributes to this. Sometimes we do want to go for a creative depth of field, but when we want to get a sharp image throughout, other factors include the focal length and where we place the focal point within the image. If you're getting really scientific and technical, the hyperfocal distance is going to give you the maximum depth of field. And this is defined as the distance beyond which all objects can be brought into acceptable focus. To be honest, I'm not usually out there calculating the hyperfocal distance. I generally learned with the guidance out there that focusing into the frame about a third into most of the wider angle landscapes will give you a pretty good depth of field with acceptable sharpness. So that is what I kind of generally have applied in my photography. However, I also think if you are scientific and want to get out there, figuring out that hyperfocal distance, that's something that you could definitely learn more about and could be really helpful. Well, one thing that I've always done, along with keeping that guidance of the 1/3, is I tend to zoom in. I use live view and I'll zoom in and I'll check all the important points in my image and make sure that they are all acceptably sharp. And if they're not, then I will adjust where my focal point is. I might close down my aperture. And that's generally how I will approach making sure that my entire image is sharp. We'll talk more about focal point and getting sharp images throughout your image in wide angle landscape specifically next week as well. With the shutter speed, as I mentioned before, if you don't have a need for a creative shutter speed, I'm usually using the shutter speed simply to get a great proper exposure. And of course, shooting in aperture mode will do that. There are certain situations, if I want to freeze the motion of water, if there's wildlife that comes into my landscape, which is always a wonderful treat, I will need to quickly switch things up and allow maybe open my aperture or raise the ISO to give me a faster shutter speed. Or on the flip side, whenever I have the opportunity to do long exposures of water or clouds, that's one of my favorite kinds of photography. So in those cases, I will figure out how to get my shutter speed slower by lowering the ISO, closing down my aperture, and using the neutral density filters as needed. I quickly wanted to just shout out to the benefit of shooting in RAW. If you don't do that already, it's so helpful in giving you more leeway, working with your exposure and with your color in post-processing. And this format collects so much more information than JPEG. But if you aren't shooting RAW already and you switch over, just be prepared that your straight out of camera shots don't look quite as punchy and colorful and contrast as the JPEGs. When you're figuring out your exposure with landscapes, there's a couple different metering modes that I might use in my landscape photography. I use evaluative or matrix, which takes into account the tones throughout the frame, but also I sometimes will use spot metering depending on the scene if I'm trying to really check a certain area, really bright highlights. You know, there's also a spot metering to protect your highlights on a lot of cameras these days, and that's really helpful to protect those brightest highlights. One thing I really recommend is that you get to know your camera and the different metering modes and see how they work if you're metering at 0, because it seems in theory that should give you the best base exposure, but depending on your metering mode and depending on the scene and the dynamic range, sometimes metering at 0, you can still have blown highlights, or in other situations, you could actually bump that exposure a little bit more to the right of your histogram, which I'm gonna share in just a minute. So I would really encourage you to work with your camera because every camera is different, and then to look at each scene as a new situation as well, because there's not a perfect recipe. How do you find good exposure? And to start with, I just wanted to mention that in certain cases, you may be fine with blown highlights or clip shadows. Maybe you want a silhouette or whatnot in your image, but I think that it's a great thing to know and understand what you're doing and just to be intentional with your art. So that's why I wanted to just share some of this information about metering and how to keep your exposure within this histogram. On this page, you can see the top on the right is the histogram for the image below it. And I find it really helpful to keep an eye on my histogram and my camera while I'm shooting. The ideal exposure will fall within the 2 walls without the tones going up on the right or going up on the left. When they start climbing the right, our highlights are blowing. And when they start climbing the left, it means we've lost detail in our shadows. I'm always trying to make sure I'm not blowing out highlights, especially in important areas. And on the flip side, I know that noise is introduced when shadows are increased in post-processing. So I always want to expose as bright as I can without overexposing. I know that if I get the image into my computer and I think it looks brighter than I want it to for the mood that I'm trying to convey, I can always bring that exposure down. But I know that if I expose brighter in camera, I will minimize the noise. Another thing that really helps me is to have the highlight warnings on in my camera so that I can tell if I have blown out an area of the image. It gives me that information for sure. I think it can be easy to rely also on your LCD screen, which is often brighter and can make you think that you've exposed properly. And at times it can be very misleading. So that is something that I think is also important to remember, and why I turn on the histogram, the warnings, and the different color channels in my camera, so I am able to check that if I have any questions about my exposure. A quick note about exposure bracketing, which I will talk about again in more detail next week. Sometimes you have certain scenes where the dynamic range is so great that you can't get all those tones in between the two walls without getting those blown highlights or clip shadows. And in some situations, both. If you are capturing a really high dynamic scene and you just want to ensure that you have all the information in the highlights and in the shadows, sometimes it can be helpful to capture multiple frames. And this just ensures that you have all the data when you get it back to your computer. I will admit, sometimes I take more images, and when I get back to my computer, I don't need them all, but I am glad that I have them so that I don't get back and think, oh, that sky doesn't have enough detail, or I'm raising these shadows and the noise is too much. Taking that approach of having those exposures just ensures that I will be happier with the results when I start to process. So again, we'll talk about a little bit more detail on different ways of exposure bracketing in next week's webinar. White balance is the last kind of setting that I wanted to discuss real quick for this evening, until we kind of go on to some mindset as we get out in the field. This is an image I took this summer just recently in my city of Chicago. And the only thing that's different of these two next to each other is just the white balance is changed. There's different approaches to white balance in camera. Many people choose to use auto. Sometimes people use the presets or use Kelvin. I usually use Kelvin, which often translates to some of the presets. For example, like 5500 is the daylight preset. Usually when I'm out shooting, I'm trying to match my white balance to what I'm seeing in front of me. And sometimes I'll go for creative in camera, or I will adjust creatively in post-processing when I'm going for a particular mood. Sometimes I envision that when I'm out shooting and I know what I want to do. Shooting in RAW helps me to be able to do that with the more information RAW collects. And I think this hopefully shows how just a change in your white balance can really change the mood of your image. So if you're going for a particular feeling, adjusting your white balance, sometimes even just subtly, can really change how that story is conveyed to a viewer and how you will remember it for yourself when you look back at that image. This one was a 15-second exposure, and kind of smoothed out some of the water. It was a really beautiful night once the sun had gone down a little bit more. So I really want to encourage you, whenever you can, to practice wherever you are. Don't wait for travel or an exciting location to practice techniques. Get comfortable with your camera and all your gear, or new techniques like bracketing or long exposures in your own backyard or a local park. Doing this really helps the technical become natural and second nature. And then when you're out traveling or in some amazing location, you won't be fumbling with your gear or figuring out the technique while you're losing the light. This image was captured in actually in one of my local arboretums at golden hour as the sun was starting to go down and just illuminating some of the last of the fall foliage. I love the way the symmetry of the reflection and the foliage that was right in the middle was being lit up by the sun. Technical versus creative. So we talked about the ideas of some of these technical things and checking your focus and checking your exposure and so forth. I hear some people will say, I'm a really technical photographer, and others will say, I'm not that technical, I'm just more creative. And I understand where some people can kind of go with one or the other, or maybe they feel like just one comes more naturally to me. I feel like I am both and try to really incorporate them together because I think they're both really important. I think technical knowledge and skills really open the door for our creativity to flourish. When technical skills become second nature, our mind is more open to possibilities, and it's not bogged down by technical challenges, trying to get your camera to do just what you want it to do. When changing all your settings and getting things set up for long exposure and and getting your tripod in the right position, when those things become second nature and natural, it just frees your mind up to be taking in the experience, to be sensing the nature, to seeing new perspectives, and it's less about the gear. So that's one reason I recommend just really getting comfortable with all of the techniques and gear so that you can really just get into this creative flow. On the note of technical focus, sharp images, perfect exposure, all those technical things, don't let perfectionism get in the way. Whether it is something that's too dark or too bright, or something's maybe a little soft, or the composition's a teeny bit off from what you want, try not to let getting that perfect image be always your goal, because I know that when I'm out shooting, I think about those technicals and I work to learn them. But when I look at my LCD screen and like audibly sigh because what I see is capturing how I feel in that moment, that's what gets me excited. And when I call my images, I look for some technical things, but what makes me stop and say, that's the one I want to edit, is the way that it makes me feel. And I try to learn when I see things that I might have done differently, to learn for next time. But just because I might do something differently next time doesn't mean that I can't love that image right now. So that's just one thought as well. Don't let striving for the perfect image keep you from loving what you're shooting now and from sharing that with others. Mindset is critical to success and satisfaction in landscape photography. Our gear and our technical skills allow us to create photographs, but it's our vision and personal expression that make them interesting and unique to us. So I just think this is really important, that we allow our vision to come out and to get into that flow. So how we think about it is so important. So I recommend that you scan the scene, have a little scan, has certain phrases and ideas here. The first, slow down and explore the world around you. So slow down and take the time to explore. Instead of putting that tripod right in the scene, you walk up, give yourself time to look around, connect with the scene. What is speaking to you? What is drawing you into this particular location? What do you see? What do you feel? What do you smell? I think this is really important, to feel that connection with nature before we set up our camera, before we click that shutter. Look all around you in every direction, get low, get high, find different perspectives, and see what is speaking to you most strongly. Sometimes the beauty is not always in the direction that we think it's going to be. Lastly, ends for no expectations. Go out without expectation. When you do this, your mind is open to possibilities rather than stuck on what you may have pre-visualized. Be open to what Mother Nature brings you that day. When you do this, you become open to opportunities and you may find beauty you never expected. Allow yourself to be surprised. Tell your story. I think that's so important, is, you know, listening to your voice and what you feel when you're out there. Why are you clicking that shutter and taking this particular image home with you? Compose your frame with whatever lens you need so that you can tell that story of that moment to your future self, and to those who aren't there. And think about including what's important and excluding what will distract, which is something else we'll talk about more next week. I have a few images that kind of go along with this scanning perspective, that I'll talk about for just a little bit each. This particular image is one that I took not long ago on our family vacation out in Yosemite, captured from Glacier Point. And this image shows these two waterfalls, Nevada and Vernal Falls. This is the first time I'd been to, not to Yosemite, but to Glacier Point, and it was awe-inspiring. But one of the things that stood out for me on this particular day was looking down at these two waterfalls, because earlier that day, my family had hiked to Vernal Falls, which is the one at the bottom of the frame. Most of my family didn't make it to the top, but my middle son wanted to get all the way to those top of those falls. So I went with him. It was quite the hike. And it was kind of an amazing experience to go and do that with him. And I found it just really, that looking down on that from Glacier Point was an interesting experience, knowing we had been there that morning. So for me, those two experiences became intertwined. And this image just makes me think of that memory, both of the standing there in that moment, as well as our hike earlier in the day. I included both waterfalls as I loved the way they were on this diagonal. And because my 13-year-old kept talking about how he wished we could have also gone to Nevada Falls, which was just not in the cards on that particular day. My settings are down at the bottom. I shot this with my 24-105 at 105 millimeters to zoom in on these two waterfalls. So this is another one, just capturing what the scene was for me. This was a morning earlier this summer, hiking to this favorite lake of mine with two friends of mine for sunrise. We were a little slow, weren't getting there quite as early for sunrise as I normally like, but we made it there and saw this amazing mist. The colors hadn't come yet, but the atmosphere was just amazing. Part of me, of course, felt rushed because I wanted to get all my stuff out and just capture all this amazing beauty. But I walked along the lake and just found where I knew I was going to be really happy with my perspective. I love this perspective. It's a lake I've been to many times, and I just kind of wandered over there. And I used a longer exposure of 15 seconds to enhance the softness that I was already feeling from the mist and the movement of the clouds, as it only briefly was revealing the grand up there at the top of the frame. This is another example of really thinking about what is speaking to me and what I want to take home from a particular day. I walked up to this lake, another glacial lake in Grand Teton National Park, for sunrise. And as I walked up, this little tree here in the center of the frame was calling to me from the moment I stepped out of the car and started walking toward the lake. I noticed it standing alone and reflecting in the water. There wasn't any sun on it at the time, but I noticed it and I was like, oh, how would I capture that? Because that is really speaking to me. over the course of the morning, the sun came up and there weren't any clouds making things all that interesting in the sky, but the reflection and the light on the mountains and the trees was really amazing. And over the course of the morning, the sun started to hit this little tree. And I noticed that it was also hitting the trees and the rock on either side, just framing this tree with the shadows behind. So I used a longer lens to just frame this single tree and tell the story of where it sat between these trees and this rock. So it's 150 millimeters here. This is again, one more situation where really trying to isolate what was speaking to me in that moment. This was during a retreat in 2019, as all the ladies and I stood at an iconic spot of Oxbow Bend. I was working with them on shooting really long exposures of clouds using either 15 or 10 6 stop. So we were doing these, they were all doing these long exposures of like 3 minutes, and we were there for a while, just really enjoying all the clouds floating by. And as I stood there, I noticed this peak over to the right and all these layers of trees and color going up toward the mountain peak. And it really spoke to me. And so real quickly, as we were, you know, just everyone was kind of standing around, I just grabbed my lens and isolated those things in this frame. And one thing that's interesting to note here is that while I was standing at this iconic location with all these mountains surrounding, just below those yellow trees at the bottom is the road. So there's cars going through and some cars parked. And so the wider scene would have had all these distractions. So shooting this with the longer lens allowed me to focus in on just the things that were really appealing to me in that moment. This is just a quick example of how I love to look all around me in every direction. This also was taken at the iconic location of Oxbow Bend at sunrise, while we were all marveling over the light on Mount Moran and the reflection in the Snake River. I took time to look to the east as the light was lighting up the mist and happened to notice the single tree standing there. And after looking over there several times and just kind of noticing the tree, I grabbed my 150 to 600 and zoomed in and just really loved how the colors and mist were surrounding this little tree. So even when you're faced with, you know, this grand scene and iconic spot, sometimes you can find beauty in other directions as well. Just a quick example, 2 quick examples. I know we're kind of getting out and I'm getting near finish, so I'll just hurry up. But these are, I have a couple examples of not holding expectations and ending up with something that you really, really love. This image was captured in the same fall of 2019 retreat on the rainiest, most overcast day we had. And this, this day was just kind of dreary and blah, and we spent some time having creative discussion, but we wanted to get out and we went for a drive and went to one of my favorite lakes and we're admiring, started drizzling the raindrops on the lake, and we noticed all these clouds just coming down through the trees. And so I was pointing them out to everybody and grabbing longer lenses to capture that atmosphere that was truly mesmerizing on this day that was just kind of blah. It turns out this is one of my favorite images from that week, and it was definitely an unexpected image. You just never know what can happen, even on days you don't think there's a lot out there. One more, let go of your expectations. This was captured last fall in the Smoky Mountains. My friend and I hiked up that steep incline to Klingman's Dome and up to the platform. And of course, we're aware that there were supposed to be these 360-degree views of mountains. And we had a 360-degree view of fog and trees right in front of our noses and nothing really beyond. So we just, you know, we figured, oh, who knows what's going to happen? And we just hung around and waited. And for a while, we still saw fog, and probably were there for probably about an hour to hour and a half as the sun rose. And most of the time we just saw fog, but there were just a few moments that lasted mere seconds where the fog would thin and some of the light would come through and gave us this really soft light and beautiful fog amongst the trees. So it was just one of those surprises. And Mother Nature just brought only a few seconds of this beauty, but I was just mesmerized by it. And this was 32 millimeters with the 24 to 70. So to wrap up everything we've kind of talked about today, preparing for landscape photography set for success. A couple of years ago, I wrote a blog article, called it 4 Ingredients for Impactful Landscape Imagery. And just want to run through real quick to wrap up. The first, and I sort of changed actually my 4th ingredient that I'll explain a little bit. The first one is craft, which I consider to be the gear you choose to be your tools and honing your technical skills. This involves developing comfort with all the gear and techniques involved creating technically solid imagery. The second ingredient is vision, which is where your own personal expression and creative voice comes in. Compelling imagery, as we've said, is more than just checking off the boxes of proper exposure and sharp focus. So really learning to see and see different perspectives. The third, which seems obvious, is opportunity. Of course, we have to get out in order to create images. We have to create and seize the opportunity to get out there, to create photographs and to propel our learning. You have to set the alarm for sunrise, go for that hike, bring the camera along on your next walk, or set up your tripod simply for practicing or learning a new technique. Through each experience we have, our minds are stretched. Our eyes learn to see new things, and reviewing the images on our computers allows us to see things we might have missed in the field. This is one of the best learning opportunities there is, and one of the ways I have learned more than anything in my photography. The last ingredient I had in my blog post is the luck of Mother Nature. It is still true that this definitely helps, because if you go out to explore and Mother Nature brings dramatic colors, storms, or a double rainbow, of course, these conditions are awesome for compelling images. But I think more than luck is attitude. Surely we dream of those amazing dramatic conditions, but when we open our minds to possibilities and go out with expectation, we just might discover beauty we never anticipated, no matter what Mother Nature brings us. As both a photographer and a busy mom, I often find myself longing for more opportunities to shoot and figuring out how to get them. But one lesson I have learned being in the position when I can't be out there all the time or as much as I want is to see and appreciate the beauty that is in front of me. Not only can it make us more successful if we're open to possibilities rather than putting the camera away when we don't get what we hope for, it also is a mindset that makes us happier photographers. If we only see the beauty in the epic jaw-dropping sunrises and sunsets, we will be disappointed more than not. So be open to possibilities no matter what nature brings, and you will find it not only enhances and expands your art, but also increases your enjoyment of the experience. And I really think that's truly what it's all about. So to finish up for this week, I just wanted to give kind of an assignment prompt for shooting. So hopefully everyone will have some images to share for the final webinar. But to get out into nature, slow down and connect. Use your tools to create an image or images that tell your story. And then I just again included the lenses that I've used for all the images throughout tonight's presentation. So thank you so much for joining me. And if you have any specific questions for me tonight, surely I can help answer them, and they may end up being answered in future webinars as well, but happy to share.
Thank you, Kristen. Yeah, we do have a few questions that you touched on a lot of them as you went, and I think having the settings on the pictures was very helpful.
Okay.
one of the questions in regards to the settings, a couple photos had ISO 1600 and
Mhm.
aperture of 1/1250th of a second. And some
You mean
people ask,
shutter, you mean shutter speed of excuse me, shutter speed of 1/1250?
yeah, shutter speed was
Okay.
1/1250th and
Yeah.
ISO was 1600.
Yeah.
And
Why?
people were asking why, I think like 3 images had that.
Yeah. Because those images were all shot handheld with the 150 to 600. And I have learned through my experience that if I am shooting that handheld, I need that shutter speed to be there to avoid my own camera shake.
Okay.
So I choose to raise the ISO to get proper exposure, compensating for my shutter speed that I know I need to not have that blur, which took a little experimenting.
That's a good tip. Longer lens, faster shutter speed.
Yeah, and I know, I mean, there's ideally I could put that on a on a tripod, but then there's also certain times where it, just the moment calls and I quickly get it handheld. So I'm not afraid to do that if that's necessary.
Another common question was a lot of people were interested in what type of tripod you use and
Oh,
what type of neutral density filters
okay.
you like.
My I've used a bunch of tripods. My favorite tripod currently is the Peak Design travel tripod, and I have the carbon fiber one. It is light, compact, and by far the easiest I've ever used in terms of flow, putting my camera on and adjusting. So,
Um,
oh,
and
and
oh, go
the
on.
filters, right? The
Yeah.
filters that I use right now are all from Breakthrough Photography.
Okay. Kind of an abstract question, and I really
Yeah.
liked how you talked about the why of images and how you felt something was calling to you. Somebody asked, in a nutshell, how much time do you dedicate to sort of roaming around when you're going to shoot? Do you have some sort of, you mentioned you were on a family trip and
Oh,
saw something, and I know having kids, it can be tricky, but do you sort of go out with an intention, I'm going to do it for this long?
well, I guess the honest answer would be that it really depends on whether I'm by myself or whether I'm with my family, which is two very different answers. When I go by myself, I probably less intention. For example, like I'll just like, for example, if I go to the Grand Tetons, I will just drive. I'll start driving through and just what calls me, and I'll go and I'll take my time and explore for however long I'm seeing things. My family probably gets, they definitely pull me along. I have to be quicker. We would just did a road trip out in California from San Diego up to Yosemite, and I saw so many more images in my head than I was able to even pull out the camera for, because that wasn't the goal of the trip.
Mhm.
um, so it kind of it, that I mean, when it comes to family, it depends. That's much harder. I have to try to think a little bit more on the fly, and I don't get sometimes as immersed because they pull me along.
Yeah,
If
that's
that
gotta happen.
answers the question. But if I'm going alone, I just allow myself to stay as long as I want, and I'll experiment with it. I mean, I could play with water shutter speeds for hours,
Mhm.
just with the timing and different shutter speeds, or I'll try various different things. I'll do long exposure, I'll do shorter exposures, different perspectives. One thing, when I'm with my family, I have to be much quicker, and it's like, okay, a couple perspectives and I might have to go. So
Okay.
it's how it is for now sometimes. That's why I have some solo trips.
Yeah, that's a totally different vibe to a solo trip.
Yeah.
Everybody's thanking you, and like this, the mentioning of the filters, breakthrough photography. Some people
Yeah.
are helping in the chat,
Yeah.
but everybody is saying thank you and love this class and are looking
Oh,
forward to the next one. A few people have mentioned, and the future one, some of the more beginners were saying more of the whys to
okay.
your settings, but
Okay.
I know this is going to be a variety of people, but everybody loves it, and I'm sure in
Yeah,
fourth.
I'm hoping to try to impart some technical for more beginners, as well as just some ideas as well for inspiring, because I do feel so important that we think about our own vision and what's speaking to us as much as just those technicals. But yeah, I will try to explain some more of the settings in the next couple of webinars. I think I packed so much in too. I was like realizing that I was getting a little bit
No,
close to
it
the end.
was awesome. It was awesome. You were on the flow, and the images were great, and it was just super informative. And everybody saying simply amazing. Follow the flow of your presentation, and so thank you so much. And with that,
I
we're
look
going to
forward to
wrap
next
up.
week. Yeah,
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you so much. This was
you're welcome.
excellent. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to the next 3 weeks.
Yeah, me too. Me too. So I hope everyone comes back for further elaboration and new stuff as well.
Yes.
And this is being recorded, and all 4 of the classes will be recorded and posted on Samy's YouTube channel. And you'll also get an email with a link. Yeah.
Great.
Perfect.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for having us, Samys, and thank you, Kristen. And thank you, everyone who came out. We'll see you the next 3.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming tonight.
Okay. Ciao, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.